Hey, boys and girls. My light is really bright today, but when I turn the light off, it's a little dark because it's starting to rain right now. And it's kind of dark and blah outside. Anyway, we finished our story yesterday. We finished the K, and hopefully some of you got to finish, or some of you got to watch some of the movie of the K, and you could see how completely and totally different it was from the book. Lots of things left out from the book, but still a good movie nonetheless. So if you haven't watched it yet, take the opportunity to do that because it's pretty good. It's pretty good. So all right. So today we're gonna read to you. It's a book by Patricia Polacco. And if you guys remember, Patricia Polacco is the one who wrote The Keeping Quilt, and she was the Keeping Quilt was the one that we saw at the Mazza Museum when we went there in September. So she's one of my favorite authors, and you guys know that because I've read quite a few of her books. So today I'm going to read you a story called January Sparrow. Now, if you can look on the front of the book, you can see that there are two African American people on the front, and if you can see really closely, there's a little sparrow in the little girl's hand, and this is a wooden sparrow that this adult person made for this little girl. And the sparrow plays a really important role in this story, towards like about 3/4 of the way through the story. So this is a story that takes place during slavery in America. And as you know, or maybe you don't know, but the North, like in Ohio, where we are, the northern states north of the Ohio River, we were all non-slave states. We did not think that slavery was a good thing, because slavery, often the slaves owners, who they called their masters, were very, very unkind to their slaves. Not everyone, but many of them were. And so anything south of the Ohio River, those were slave states, and they had lots of slavery there. They depended on their slaves for their income, for so many things in their lives. And so this is a story about something called the Underground Railroad. Now, it's not a real railroad. It's not like one that we see going through Cridersville or Wapak, the trains. It's not a real railroad. It's a series of stops in safe places for slaves who wanted to escape from slavery. They didn't want to be part of the slave be slaves anymore, so they would escape. And there were places, even in the South, that were safe places, and they called them railroads because they called the people who led them through the Underground Railroad, they called them conductors. And then the places where they stayed were called the stations. And so, and they were secret. It was a big underground thing. It was secret. It's called underground because it was a secret. Um, so, anyway, so this is a story that takes place during that time and the Underground Railroad. If you remember, many of you have probably heard of Harriet Tubman, and she was one of the conductors on the Underground Railroad. So she is not in this story, but you're going to hear about some of the people that are in this story. So we can see, let's go to, all right, so this picture right here just signifies or shows us that slaves were, they were trapped. They couldn't leave their masters, because their masters depended on them. And if they did leave, they would capture them, and there would have some serious consequences. And you can see this picture right here. This is the main person in the story, and his name is January, and he was pulled. He had tried to escape, and then he was made. They made an example of him. So we're going to read the story, and I'm going to show you the pictures. All right. So I'm going to just kind of turn over here, and I'm going to just kind of read to you this way. Hopefully this will work. All right. I have been called many things in my time, so you don't need to know that now. I've been owned by white folks for a good part of my life. I can tell you this, they's white folks that have gizzards for hearts, They ain't got no mercy or kindness to 'em. But they some white folks that do. I don't forget them. I was sold away from my mama and hauled all the way to Hunter's Bottom in Carroll County, Kentucky, when I wasn't no taller than a porch rail. Sarah and Adam Crosswhite, even though they was slaves themselves, took me in and held me as they own at the Giltner plantation. The master wasn't so mean to us in them days, but after his wife died, he took to beating me regular. I was there when Sarah Crosswhite birthed all of her children. John was first, then Ben, then Cyrus, and then came our little sparrow, Sadie. She was all of 8 when this story began. This here is Sadie's story. You hark now, I'm going to tell it for her, near as I can. Now, we know that this is written in first person because we hear the word I, okay? Now, I want you to think about who the narrator of the story is. Is the narrator of the story the author, or is the narrator of the story someone else? All right? So by the end of the story, you're going to figure that out. But right now, I want you to think about who is telling the story, okay? So this person, obviously, that wrote the story, or that told the story, was a slave. All right? Sadie, the youngest Crosswhite, shuddered when she saw the patty rollers thunder into the slave yard on their horses, dragging a runaway on the end of a rope behind them. All the slaves had been ordered to stand at the porch railing that morning. They all feared the same thing on that plantation, Master Francis Giltner. Sadie's mama and daddy, Sarah and Adam Crosswhite, and all her brothers gripped at that rail when they saw him rolling up in his fine carriage, sitting right next to his youngest son David and his nephew Francis Troutman. The patty rollers hollered and whooped as they skidded to a stop, then hauled off in they horses, and they tussled the runaway to his feet. So we have a runaway slave here. Sadie almost fell to her knees when she saw who it was they was dragging. It was January. He had been held so dear to her and her family for as long as she could remember. Her heart fair broke as they smote him and pushed him face down in the dirt to stake his arms and his legs. Sadie knew January was fixin' to run. He told her himself only 2 days before, when he upped and did it. Sadie prayed he'd cross water and make it into Indiana. But now she could see that it wasn't a flick of a sorry dog's tail, for they done caught him and they brung him back. They tried to escape, and they caught him. Master Giltner stood over January. This here dirt-eating, lazy, no-account known as January Drum took up and ran. I want you all to see what happens to any brown-skinned devil that runs away from me, he thundered. Then he motioned to the 2 men holding black snake whips. They was Jimmy Lee and Willie Ford, his patty rollers and overseers. First, Ford whipped January across his back so hard that it cracked the air. With each lash, January's flesh opened up in long red stripes almost to his rib bones. Then, while Ford was taking a dipper of water, Lee commenced to whipping January the other direction, so as to make his flesh stand up in squares. Lee and Ford whipped and kicked the rags right off from him, but they couldn't make January holler. Sadie's brother Ben could hardly stand. His knees kept giving out with each stroke of the whip. Even though the master had ordered all them to watch, Ben just hung his head. When the beating was done, Lee and Ford rubbed salt and pepper into January's open back. His skin jerked, quaked, and January twisted and puked up, but he never cried out. All right, I'm going to turn it this way, see if this is a little bit better. Sarah, Sadie's mama, scrambled over past January to Master Giltner's carriage and his son David. Sarah had held David's mama in her arms when she was getting him born, but his mama died birthing him. No one knew what to do, so Sarah took that baby home with her. She took him to her own breast, even when the other slaves would say, "You loving one of them white folks is like a dog loving the hickory what beats it." But love him she did, and he loved her back. His own daddy hated the sight of him. He blamed that baby for his wife's death. Sarah Crosswhite was the onlyest person that loved David. So when her eyes fell on his now, he turned away. How do you think he's feeling right now? Yeah, he grew up in that family. By the time the sun set that evening and everyone walked from the slave yard from the fields, January was gone. Each of them looked where he had laid and bowed their heads and touched their hearts. When Sarah and his children arrived home that night, they all ate in silence. Adam, their daddy, arrived late, carrying a shovel. His clothes covered in mud, 'cause he'd said he'd been digging a grave. They all knew who that grave was for. Sadie burst into tears. She ran into the window light just above her cot, and took a small wooden sparrow from the sill. She held the sparrow next to her cheek as tears burned in her eyes. January had whittled it just for her. She ran her fingers over each of its feathers that he had carved so carefully. She remembered January whispering to her when he put it into her hands, "It's fixin' to fly, and so is I." She'd known he was going to run. She'd said nothing to no one. Now her heart ached at the thought that she hadn't told her mama and daddy. Maybe they could have stopped January. Then he wouldn't have been beaten, and he'd still be here. She cried herself to sleep. That night, it was still and black. The next thing Sadie knew, she was shaken awake. "Wake up, Sadie, wake up," her mama whispered breathlessly. "But why, Mama, what's happening?" Sadie moaned. She fussed and cried, but she got up. "Get dressed and pack only what you can carry, and don't light the lantern," Adam warned. So all of them felt their way around the cabin, pulling out clothes and crawling into them. The rest they stuffed into burlap bags. Sadie's heart was a-racing. All the children and their mama huddled around the door in the darkness. "Hark now," their daddy whispered. "We's going to cross water tonight." Everyone looked at one another. Sadie just didn't understand what had happened. "Now, all you stay close to me. Thaddeus Quill's coming to take us to the boat," Adam whispered. When Thaddeus arrived, they all sneaked out, not making a sound. They crossed the slave yard, went by the big house, and finally stood near the bottoms. Just as they were about to start into Eliza's woods, Sadie suddenly cried out, "Mama!" Sarah clapped her hands over Sadie's mouth. "Quiet, girl," Sarah warned. "My sparrow! January's sparrow! I left it on the sill," Sadie whispered. Her father knelt in front of her. "Oh, sweet baby, we can't go back for it now. It's too dangerous," he whispered as he hugged her and stared into the woods. "Why are we leaving anyway?" Sadie sobbed. She couldn't understand where they were running to and why without her sparrow. Sarah took Sadie's face in her hands. "They was coming to fetch the boys in the morning. We heard it ourselves. They was going to be auctioned off." "Ain't nobody taking any of my babies," Sarah mumbled. They all walked in silence through the woods after that. It seemed like hours, until Thaddeus put up his hand. They could hear rushing waters. "That's the Ohio River," Thaddeus whispered. "And that's the water we gonna cross tonight," Adam nodded. Sadie's heart was beating so hard she could hear it. As they came to the bank of the river, they could see a small rowboat near the shore. "I hear!" a girl's voice called out from the shadow of the boat. "Get in!" They all crawled into the rocking boat. The current took the boat right away. The boat girl rowed with her head bowed so's they couldn't see her face. Adam knew about these boat lifters. He knew not to call Sarah and his children by name. So if Patty Rollers took to beating the girl, she couldn't tell him names she never heard. He knew she wouldn't look at any of their faces, so she couldn't tell him about faces she done never seen. The girl took to pulling them oars with the power of a growed man. Sadie and her brothers caught their breath when the boat leaned way over with the strong current. "Hush now," the girl said. "Sound carries across the water. I done this so many times, I know every turn, back, bottom, rock, and whirl round in this here river, so don't none of you fret." All of them watched as the shore of Kentucky disappeared into the fog. They all tried to look ahead for the shore of Indiana where they were heading, but the fog was too thick. The boat pitched and rolled, and water commenced to boil underneath. Sadie, Ben, and Cyrus began to cry. John was trembling and clenched his teeth. They all knew that none of them could swim. "You know, there's a line right down the center of this here river," the rowing girl called out. "One side of that land you is owned. The other side you ain't. And we crossing over that line right now." They all looked at the water beneath them. "All the fish on the Kentucky side, they ain't free. But on the Indiana side, they is," the boat lifter crowed. "Pretty soon you be as free as them fish." The boat turned on itself a few more times, and then, as fast as the churning came, it was gone. They could make out a little finger of land not too far ahead. Soon the boat grounded ashore. "Folks, this here is Indiana, a free state," the rowing girl announced. And we're going to stop there for today. And we're going to find out tomorrow. I'll give you kind of a quick little preview. Here's the picture. They look a little happy in that picture. So they know that they're in free state now. Okay? So we will continue tomorrow. I still want you to be thinking, who's telling the story? You know that when I'm speaking in sort of an accent. So I want you to think about who is telling the story. All right, so tomorrow we'll look at it again, and we'll look forward to seeing all of you on Friday morning. All right, see ya.